Developing expertise in interpreting. The topic of our lecture today concerns development of expertise in interpreting. Interpreting is a very complex cognitive skill, and developing expertise in interpreting is certainly of great interest to all of us who are studying interpretation. The study of expertise has taken its bearings from problem solving, from learning theory, from ergonomics, from memory research, from reasoning, and from studies in knowledge representation in the human brain. The development of expertise focuses in particular on progression, something we would all like to see in our students, on regression, something that perhaps we are less interested in seeing, but which occurs regularly as people learn and acquire new skills. The anticipation of errors and the role of practice. Progression. In order to acquire a skill, we all need to progress. However, it is also obvious to anyone who has ever observed somebody acquire a skill that although most learners do progress, some of them more rapidly than others, some of them more regularly than others, there are times when certain plateaus are reached and a learner seemingly no longer progresses. Worse yet, some learners even regress, which is rather frustrating for anyone. Although, however, this is all part of acquiring expertise in any skill. There is not just a linear progression. One of the things that most teachers will learn about their learners is that if they've seen a number of students, perhaps upwards of 50 or 100, acquire the same skill, that they can anticipate the kinds of errors that learners will make. This is of fundamental importance to anyone who is teaching interpretation. To anticipate the kinds of errors learners make allows the teacher to present the right material at the right time. In order to acquire a skill, the role of practice is of utmost importance. We all know how many hours violinists, pianists, athletes spend at acquiring and perfecting their skills. The same is true for interpretation. The role of practice, or to use Baddeley's words, the role, and Erickson's words, the role of deliberate practice, is of extraordinary importance for anyone acquiring the skill of interpretation. There are various stages that we have come to identify in the acquisition of any skill, and they also apply to interpreting. The first stage is labeled the cognitive stage. During the cognitive stage, we learn about the relevant facts in translation and interpretation, for example, text analysis, dual tasking, multitasking, paraphrasing, etc. The next stage is entitled the associative stage. During the associative stage, a learner learns from his errors. We even need to encourage learners to make errors, to consider alternatives, to discuss solutions, in order for the learner to be able to strengthen various connections of elements and to discover through experimentation with certain strategies and procedures. Once a learner has gone through the associative stage, he will reach the autonomous stage. During the autonomous stage, procedures become more and more automated and rapid. They require fewer processing resources, and the result is a skill executed with increased speed and accuracy, which is precisely what we expect of an interpretation student. There are differences that we have been able to observe between novices that is, someone who does not know a skill, has not learned a skill, and an expert who is an accomplished practitioner of a particular skill. The differences relate to 4 categories: to factual knowledge, to semantic knowledge, to schematic knowledge, and to strategic knowledge. Based on research, we can say that expert translators and interpreters have factual knowledge, better organized, with more associative connections and more domain connections. If they are uninformed, experts will revert to more novice-like performance. So even if an expert interpreter were thrown into a meeting that deals with an issue he is not familiar with, he will quite likely revert to more novice-like behavior. Semantic knowledge. Experts' semantic interpretation is always tied to context, to the context of the speech and the text, the discourse he's currently interpreting. Novices, however, approach semantic knowledge differently. Their interpretation is often unrelated to the context and unrelated to the discourse. Schematic knowledge. Experts have built up schemata for different types of speeches, negotiating situations, texts, paragraphs, and the discourse as a whole, into which individual utterances and sentences are then embedded. Novices, however, tend to consider each utterance and each sentence in a much more isolated manner. Strategic knowledge. Experts proceed from the known to the unknown. They often skip the unknown if they consider it redundant or unimportant. Novices, however, tend to focus first on the unknown, and then they get often stuck. Research has also allowed us to identify certain strategies for translation and interpretation, strategies that experts have acquired and novices need to acquire. They can be broken down into 4 different types of strategies. There are comprehension strategies, planning strategies, monitoring strategies, and workload management strategies. Comprehension strategies have much to do with the process of language comprehension as a whole. How do we comprehend, how do we understand spoken discourse? And at that, there does not seem to be a great deal of difference between interpreters and monolingual language comprehenders. Planning strategies. We all know that we engage in planning as we engage in everyday discourse. We plan out our sentences. We plan out a speech. In interpretation, planning strategies take on an entirely new role. They are of utmost importance because an interpreter, being engaged in more than one task at a time, needs to be sure that his planning is correct. Monitoring strategies. Even in everyday discourse, outside of the interpretation domain, everyday language users do engage in monitoring. Otherwise, we would not correct ourselves in everyday discourse. And we all know that we do. In interpretation, monitoring is of very, very great importance because an interpreter very often misses out on a bit of incoming discourse or misunderstands what a speaker says. If the interpreter were not able to monitor himself, he would not be able to catch the mistakes and would not be able to correct for them. However, we do know that there are limitations as to how many mistakes an interpreter can correct and how long after the mistake has been made an interpreter would still be able to correct for it. That has much to do with the last type of strategy, the workload management strategy. Interpreters, and interpretation being a very complex cognitive skill, various sub-skills need to be used simultaneously for the skill as a whole to succeed. An interpreter needs to decide, consciously or unconsciously, where to put the emphasis, what to focus on. Is it going to be on comprehending the incoming discourse, or will it be on the production of the outgoing message? Sometimes an interpreter will deliberately decide to focus exclusively on the outgoing message, perhaps because the register and the style that he needs to use are of particular importance to his audience, or perhaps a certain terminology needs to be used that he's not very, very familiar with, that he's just recently acquired, so he needs to pay great attention to employing the right terminology. As I'd already mentioned when I spoke about the various stages an learner goes through in order to acquire a skill, an interpretation student would go through in order to acquire the skill of interpretation, there is an autonomous stage, which is the last stage. And it was said at that time that a certain amount of automation takes place. Obviously, interpretation is not an entirely automated skill. If it were so, we could put robots in the booth. Nevertheless, the complexity of interpretation requires that certain sub-skills be partially automated or wholly automated in order for the interpreter to be able to manage the workload, to manage his resources, his cognitive resources appropriately, and not make too many mistakes. Automation requires a considerable amount of practice. In order to execute a movement fluently and flawlessly, a ballet dancer, for example, would have put in years and years and years of practice. Pretty much the same is true for the interpreter. It takes about 5,000 hours to become an expert. And acquiring expertise in interpretation requires a great deal of deliberate practice. Tasks then become more automated. They require less attentional resources, and once these tasks become automated, they will influence the kind of segmentation that takes place of the incoming message. An expert has a more global view of things. He will identify larger chunks in the incoming message. Novices tend to focus on individual words and often get stuck. Experts, however, look at larger chunks in the discourse. So segmentation of the incoming message is influenced. The expert is also able to recognize chunks that repeat across texts. He will be familiar, for example, with conference terminology. He will be familiar with the kind of phraseology that is employed by a particular organization. So he will recognize these phrases as larger chunks, and he will remember that he has already heard those phrases, those chunks in the past if he's worked for this particular organization. Automation also has an influence on memory. Experts will remember more as well as longer sentence patterns and longer chunks, which means that experts will be able to wait longer before they begin their interpretation because they've been able to store larger chunks in memory. They are able to manipulate larger chunks and put out a stylistically more acceptable rendition. We've seen then that to become an expert, one has to go through a variety of stages. We've seen that there are differences between novices and experts as they relate to memory and knowledge organization. And we've also learned that to become an expert requires a considerable amount of deliberate practice. Thank you very much.